Bibliophiles of the internet, since we find ourselves in April, that means the first quarter of the year has officially come to a close, which can only mean one thing. It's time to do some quarterly reading stats. Every single year, I keep a detailed spreadsheet of all my reading activity. The template I'm using for this year was created by With Ali. I will link her Etsy store and channel down below if you would like to learn more. I also supplement that with some of the stats you can get from the story graph, though I mostly crunch the numbers myself. If this is your first time watching one of my stats videos, welcome. We're going to talk about how many books I read, my most read genres, my most read publishers, most popular cover colors, favorite books of the quarter, etc. So if you want to learn far more about my reading habits than any one person should, keep watching. We're going to start, as always, with the big picture number, the total number of books I read for the quarter. And to kick off the first quarter of 2026, I read a total of 37 books. Also, fun fact, if we're taking a look at my stats year to year, that's actually the same exact number of books I read in the first quarter of 2025. What does that mean for the rest of my reading year? I really don't know. I did not set out to intentionally match that number. It's just a happy coincidence. Going a little deeper, let's do a quick overview of what I read for the first 3 months of 2026. Starting in January, I read 14 books. Those were Alec, There's Always Next Year, I'm So Happy You're Here, When the Wolf Comes Home, Son of the Morning, People We Meet on Vacation, Dogs, Boys, and Other Things I've Cried About, Heated Rivalry, The Long Game, Starling House, If All the Stars Go Dark, Espiritu, Behind Five Willows, and Perfect Victims. In February, I read 12 books. Those were The Obake Code, Wuthering Heights, The Great Disillusionment of Nick and Jay, A Lady for All Seasons, This Wretched Beauty, The Incredibly Human Henson Blaze, All the Blues in the Sky, We Are the Crisis, A Ruin Great and Free, King of the Neuroverse, The Ballad of Jacques Telehay, and The Picture of Dorian Gray. And most recently in March, I read 11 books. Those were Now I Surrender, The Red Winter, Unwritten Rules, The Bodybuilders, Project Hail Mary, Kill the Beast, Hot Girls with Balls, Bat Eater, Make Room for Love, Seasons of Glass and Iron, and Riley Dare, Slightly Witchy Sleuth. In terms of page count, I read 4,438 pages in January, 3,749 pages in February, and somehow an even 3,700 pages in March for a total of 11,887 pages. Let's go right into my top 3 most read genres for the quarter, going in ascending order from least read to most read. Coming in third place, we have contemporary, meaning books set in the modern day that have no other genre inputs. And by that definition, I read 6 contemporary books. Tied for second place is romance at 7 books and historical fiction also at 7 books. I also should have given the disclaimer that this is not an exact science, and I only count a book as being more than one genre if separating it from one of those genres would inherently change the nature of the story. For example, A Lady for All Seasons is both undeniably historical fiction and also undeniably a romance. With that said, my most read genre for the first quarter was fantasy. In the first quarter, I read 8 fantasy books. Next is a category I like to call How Many Were Queer, because as a living, breathing queer myself, I know I tend to gravitate towards queer books, and I like to calculate how many I read each quarter for science. So with that said, 20 of the 37 books I read this past quarter were queer books. That means roughly 54% of all the books I read, or just over half, were queer books. Next up, let's talk about my most read reading formats, going again from least read to most read. Taking the last spot on the leaderboard is hybrid/mixture reads, meaning books I used more than one format to finish, usually split between the audiobook and some other format. This quarter, I ended up doing 2 hybrid reads. Next, we have ebooks. I read 4 books as ebooks, and unsurprisingly, they all happen to be review copies. My second most popular format for the quarter was physical books. I read 9 books as physical books, which means, surprising no one for the I don't know how manyth quarter in a row, audiobooks were the dominant reading format for the first quarter. I read 22 books as audiobooks. That means nearly 60% of all the books I read this past quarter were enjoyed as audiobooks. Speaking of audiobooks, let's talk about how many hours I spent listening to audiobooks in the first quarter. I listened to 75 hours of audiobooks in January, 77 hours of audiobooks in February, and 78 hours of audiobooks in March, which means I spent a grand total of 230 hours listening to audiobooks. To put that in another perspective, that means I spent the equivalent of 9.5 straight days listening to audiobooks. Now let's move on to audience spread, which is where I look at the target age demographics for the books I'm reading, once again going from least read to most read. My least read demographic was children's books, which is the term I use to categorize picture books, chapter books, things like that. In the first quarter, I only read 1 children's book. The next highest demographic is middle grade, even though I only read 3 middle grade books this past quarter. My second most read demographic is young adult. In the first quarter, I read 7 young adult books. But framing YA as my second most read demographic is a very generous technicality, seeing as how the most dominant demographic by far was adult books. I read 26 fiction and nonfiction books marketed towards an adult audience. Honestly, that shouldn't surprise me anymore because I am an adult and I have been for a while, but the evidence of that does still take me by surprise because I'm not someone who considers myself as having lost touch with middle grade or young adult books. Moving along, let's look at some superlatives for longest and shortest books, starting with page count. If we're looking at a book's page count, the longest book I read in the first quarter was The Red Winter by Cameron Sullivan, which was 544 pages. On the flip side of that, the shortest book I read was definitely I'm So Happy You're Here by Michael Threets, which was 32 pages. In terms of audiobooks, the longest audiobook I listened to last quarter was, unsurprisingly, also The Red Winter, which clocked in at 16 hours and 46 minutes. The shortest audiobook I listened to, again, unsurprisingly, was I'm So Happy You're Here, which was a whopping 6 minutes. But as the only children's book I read last quarter, that is somewhat of an outlier, so if we don't count that one, the next shortest audiobook I listened to was King of the Neuroverse by Idris Goodwin, which was 3 hours and 2 minutes. I actually didn't have too many duplicate authors this quarter, but there were two authors I read from the most at 2 books apiece. One of them was Rachel Reed because I read the 2 Shane and Ilya books in the Game Changer series, and the other was Cadwell Turnbull because I read the last 2 books in the Convergence saga. While we're on the topic of authors, I like to look at how many new authors I'm discovering each quarter. So for this past quarter, in total, I read from 20 new authors. To break that down even further, I read from 9 debut authors, meaning I read the first book they had formally published, and I read 11 new to me authors, meaning authors who have been previously published, but I was reading from them for the very first time. On the flip side of that, that means I read 17 repeat authors. And to clarify, this number has been adjusted because There's Always Next Year is a co-authored book, and I've read from both of those authors before, and also Cadwell Turnbull was noted as a repeat author twice in my spreadsheet, so I only counted him once. And yes, there is kind of a disparity with Rachel Reed because obviously when I read Heated Rivalry, that was my first time reading her work, but then when I read The Long Game, she was no longer a new to me author. So on a technicality, she is counted twice. Next up, let's take a quick look at my average star rating for the quarter. In the first quarter, I rated my books an average of 4.15 stars, and yes, that math does account for quarter stars and half stars. Speaking of star ratings, I want to be more consistent about looking at my 5-star reads for the quarter, and so for the first quarter of 2026, I awarded only 4 books a full 5 stars. That means out of the 37 total books I read, 5-star reads made up only about 10.8% of my overall reading, which isn't the greatest hit rate in the world, but it's also not a competition, so I'm at peace with that. Now let's talk about my most read publishers for the quarter. This is not going to account for all the publishers I read from, just the most popular ones. And once again, going in ascending order, we'll start with small press and independently published books, of which I read 5. In third place, we have HarperCollins at 8 books, then we have Penguin Random House at 9 books, and my most read publisher for the quarter, perhaps unsurprisingly, was Macmillan at 11 books. Next is one of my favorite stats to look at, which is most popular cover colors. We're going to look at the top 5 most popular colors going in ascending order, and starting with brown, because surprisingly, I read 3 brown books this past quarter. I also read 3 red books, 5 green books, and 6 black books. And the most popular cover color for the first quarter of 2026 should not surprise anyone because it is once again blue, coming in at 11 books. Now we're going to do some series tracking. The first quarter wasn't a huge quarter for series, but we did have some activity. Overall, I read 7 books in series. To be more specific, I read from 5 different series, either finishing or completely catching up with 3 of those series. Obviously, I read 2 books in the Game Changer series with no intention of reading any of the other books besides Unrivaled coming out next year. I also caught up with the Cemetery Boy series as well as the Hamajang Lux series, which yes, is a series, even though the publisher has decided not to market it or categorize it as such. I completed the Convergence Saga by Cadwell Turnbull, although I know there's one additional book set in that same timeline or universe, and of course I read the first book in the Unwritten Rules companion series. While we're talking about series, let's look at the number of books in series I read versus standalones, and as you might be able to guess, it's not even remotely close. Like I said, I read 7 books in series, which means I read 30 standalone books. I also like to keep track of how many frontlist books I'm reading compared to backlist books, because obviously as a book reviewer, I like to keep up with what's coming out as much as possible, but I also don't want to forget older books that have been on my TBR for quite some time. So to that end, last quarter I read 14 books released in 2026 and 23 books released prior to 2026. Those numbers are pretty close, with backlist books actually having the edge in the first quarter, which I think is really interesting. So I'm good with those numbers. The most backlist books I read in the first quarter quarter are also kind of interesting because usually I'm not going back any further than the early 2000s or late 1900s, but the oldest book I read last quarter by far was Wuthering Heights, which was first published sometime in 1847. To really put that in perspective, the second oldest book I read was The Picture of Dorian Gray, which was published in 1890. And aside from those two 19th century classics, the next oldest book I read was Heated Rivalry, which came out all the way back in 2019. Now we're going to look at notable book settings for the first quarter. This stat has undergone a few different names over the years. I've called it most popular cities or countries, most popular locations, but there's a range of specificity that I don't think those labels properly convey, so I'll just be using the catch-all term of settings going forward from this point. With that said, to my shame, the most popular setting should not be a surprise. Most of the books I read, 20 of them to be specific, were set in the US. There's a very sharp drop-off after that. I read 5 books set in the UK, 5 books not set on Earth, meaning they were entirely set in fantasy worlds that don't exist or somewhere in space. 2 books were set in Canada, I'm sure you can guess which ones. Also worth noting, I read 1 book set in the Dominican Republic, 1 book set in Mexico, 1 book set in France, 1 book set in Palestine, and 1 book set in South Korea. I also love tracking how much money I save each quarter by using my local library. And while I do have to admit that the first quarter was a bit lighter when it comes to library use, I was still able to save $72.74 by checking out 1 physical book and 2 audiobooks. And I do want to note that while I did check out A Practical Guide to Dating a Demon for my April TBR, I did technically check it out in March, so it does still count towards my savings for the first quarter of 2026. My 2026 spreadsheet has a new feature where I can tier rank every book after I finish it, so I thought I would experiment with adding that in for this quarter, and you can tell me whether it's interesting to you or not. I will say that my tier ranking is more of a vibe than a science. You might think that each ranking would neatly correspond to a specific star rating, with S tier being 5 stars and going down from there, but it hasn't really worked out that way, at least for me. It's turned into more of a visual representation of my overall experience. So with that in mind, we'll start from the bottom, starting with D tier, because thankfully I didn't have any F tier reads this past quarter. D tier, I will say, is still not great. These were books I did not like, that I thought were severely lacking in execution, and books where overall I wouldn't say I enjoyed the experience. So that is where Son of the Morning and Henson Blaze both live, at least for me. You don't have to agree. Then we have the C tier, which for me means books that were enjoyable, compelling, entertaining. They had some good takeaways and solid things to offer, but they were maybe lacking in execution in a few areas. So my 6 C-star books for the first quarter were Wuthering Heights, which honestly I might retroactively move higher, we'll see, The Obake Code, The Disillusionment of Nick and Jay, Project Hail Mary, and Riley Dare's Slightly Witchy Sleuth. Next is the B tier, which are books I really enjoyed. I thought they had clear and strong thematic overtones that were successfully conveyed. They were entertaining or enjoyable, but also stylistically interesting, and overall a really good time, even though I may have had 1 or 2 notable critiques. Going by those parameters, I ended up with 12 B tier books. Those were There's Always Next Year, If All the Stars Go Dark, The Long Game, Behind Five Willows, A Lady for All Seasons, We Are the Crisis, King of the Neuroverse, The Ballad of Jacques Delahaye, Now I Surrender, The Bodybuilders, Hot Girls with Balls, and Make Room for Love. Next up is the A tier. These are really high quality books. They're compelling, they're engaging, they have something to say, they're successfully executed on multiple fronts. They will definitely stick with me and are very strong candidates to become favorite books of the year. And I'm happy to report that 13 of the books I read in the first quarter were A tier books. Those were When the Wolf Comes Home, I'm So Happy You're Here, Dogs, Boys, and Other Things I've Cried About, People We Meet on Vacation, Starling House, Heated Rivalry, A Ruin Great and Free, The Picture of Dorian Gray, Unwritten Rules, Kill the Beast, Bat Eater, and Seasons of Glass and Iron. I don't think, at least for me, that all my 5-star books are automatically going to be considered S-tier books. Again, like I said, it's very much a vibe. These are books that really blew me away, books I know I'll be recommending and sharing for years to come. There's not a single thing that I would change about them. I think they're both perfectly conceived and perfectly executed, and they have an unquantifiable amount of quality and richness to offer their audiences. By process of elimination, you can most likely guess my 4 S-tier books for the quarter, but those were Alec, Perfect Victims, Espiritu, and This Wretched Beauty. I always like to end my quarterly stats videos by sharing my top 5 favorite books of the quarter. I will give the disclaimer that not all my 5-star books and S-tier books will automatically make this list, not because I don't love them at that level, but because I want to make space to celebrate some other truly stellar, memorable, standout books. I'll keep this brief, but going in chronological order, I'm going to start with Alec by William DeCanzio. I do think this one requires a little bit of explanation, but it's basically the unofficial sequel to E.M. Forster's classic novel Morris, but instead of being told from Morris's point of view, the book is written from the perspective of Alex Scudder, the gamekeeper whom Morris falls in love with. So it retraces the events of Morris and then goes past the end of that novel and into the beginning of World War I, where both men are drafted onto the front lines. And it's basically a rumination on whether their secret love is strong enough to endure a world that has been radically changed by war and destruction and loss. I just love the project of this book so much because it's such a powerful example of carrying on a legacy of queerness that began long before us. Forster famously struggled to draft an ending for Morris because at the time he was finishing the manuscript, World War I was just beginning, and he had no idea what the future for Morris and Alec might actually look like. So I think it's such a tremendous act of love for DeCanzio to then take over a century of hindsight and actually imagine a future that these two characters could have feasibly lived through while still maintaining the integrity and intent of what Forster was trying to accomplish. I think that is nothing less than an incredible artistic feat. I also really enjoyed my experience reading Starling House by Alex E. Harrow. Like I said in my January wrap-up, I was absolutely eviscerated after reading The Everlasting last year, and that really pushed me to want to read more from Alex E. Harrow's backlist. And reading Starling House proved to me that what I felt after finishing The Everlasting was far from a fluke. Not only is this an innovative blend of fantasy and horror aesthetics, but it has really powerful things to say about how protecting other people doesn't always have to mean shielding them from the bad things, or taking hits on their behalf so that they don't have to feel the pain. It also means trusting people to know what they can withstand, giving people the tools and agency and opportunities they need to face the hard things themselves, and believing that someone else will be there to hold the line when we inevitably fall down. This was just fantastic, and it made me even more excited to hopefully read more from Alex E. Harrow in 2026. I'm sure precisely 0 people will be shocked to hear that one of my favorite books of the first quarter, no contest, was Espiritu by Aidan Thomas. This is the sequel to Cemetery Boys coming out in September, and it absolutely lived up to and even surpassed all of my expectations. Honestly, what is there even to say? It's a powerful love letter to community and all its beauty and complexity, to breaking down barriers, to trusting each other even when it's scary to do so, and knowing that holding fast to each other is the only way we fight our way out of the darkness. It's every bit as funny and chaotic and heartwarming as Cemetery Boys, but it also brilliantly takes the characters and relationships to new heights. To say that I'm excited for this book to finally be out in the world later this year would be a massive understatement. Another no-brainer for this list was This Wretched Beauty by Elle Grenier. This is the latest installment in Macmillan's Remix Classic series. It reimagines the already queer story of Dorian Gray, but imagines a young Dorian as a trans femme non-binary person. First of all, I listened to this as an audiobook, and the audiobook is incredibly well produced and performed. I highly recommend it if you can access it. But even beyond the audio experience, this was just an unbelievably beautiful book that really honors the source material with its thoughtfulness, its philosophical nature, and its incredibly gilded prose. It's really asking that question of what it means to grow into the person we're meant to be instead of being warped into an idealized version of ourselves that we can never hope to actually recreate. And I really love how it explores those questions. Before we get into my last pick, I do want to give an honorable mention to Unwritten Rules by Katie Casey, because that book really stole my heart. It thoroughly surprised me and brought me so much joy to an extent I never would have expected. I'm still thinking about it, and I'm really motivated to continue with the companion series. So definite shout out to them, but my 5th and final favorite book of the quarter would have to be Kill the Beast by Sarah Swift. I love a fun, innovative, whimsical fantasy adventure, and this story absolutely hits that brief. It's about a mercenary named Lysa whose brother was horrifically killed by a fairy-made monster known as the Beast. She has spent 13 years trying to avenge his death unsuccessfully, and that's when she gets commissioned by this brainless dandy named Elderic, who claims he knows where the Beast is and how to finally destroy it. This is exactly the kind of fantasy story I love. The two main characters are both canonically bi, and even though they're a delightfully mismatched pair with entirely different aesthetics and sensibilities, they cultivate this really beautiful, tender, queer platonic relationship by the end. Not only is this a really fun and entertaining fantasy adventure, but it's also a testament to how love is both an opportunity for us to be so much more than we appear, and also a force that's strong enough to withstand all our contradictions and complexities, if only we allow it to. So I just really love this. So there you have it. Those are all my reading stats for the first quarter of 2026. If there are any other stats you'd like me to include or exclude going forward, let me know. I'm open to ideas, but I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something. And until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.